Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues, students, and fellow researchers. I am Nathan Chapman, a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of the West Indies. As a decolonial scholar fervently committed to understanding coloniality and sociocultural inequality, I address this social issue. It is with great pleasure and a sense of purpose that I'm here to discuss a topic that has captivated my attention and stirred profound concern about trinbago Trumpism. Trinbago Trumpism is a multifaceted social phenomenon rooted in historical legacies of colonialism and perpetuated by neo-colonial discourses in Trinidad and Tobago. This complex phenomenon mirrors Eurocentric attitudes towards indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and indentured laborers throughout the nation's history. Despite advancements since independence, colonial attitudes persist, influencing societal perceptions and treatments of vulnerable populations. This study critically examines the sources of inequality underlying contemporary local attitudes towards Venezuelan migrants in Trinidad and Tobago. Building upon recent studies, the researcher connects these attitudes to their colonial past using the coloniality of being theory and cyber ethnography. This approach sheds light on the complex socio-cultural underpinnings of anti-immigrant sentiment towards Venezuelan migrants. Conceptualizing trinbago Trumpism as a neo-colonial discourse, this study highlights its resemblance to historical and contemporary attitudes towards Venezuelan migrants in Trinidad and Tobago. These attitudes, rooted in Eurocentric ideologies, have persisted from the colonial era to the post-independence period, shaping societal dynamics despite changes in power structures. While historically subordinated groups have gained social mobility, they continue to propagate attitudes derived from colonial legacies. Colonial attitudes deeply entrenched notions of European superiority and the marginalization of non-European peoples, shaping migration dynamics and social hierarchies in the Caribbean. Since Columbus's arrival in 1492, the West Indies became a focal point of European conquest and colonization, leading to the renaming of indigenous peoples as Caribs and Arawaks. Europeans imposed their cultural norms and values onto indigenous cultures, relegating those who did not conform to European standards to the status of savages. When you really look into Trinidad's history, in Trinidad in particular, colonial attitudes shaped migration patterns, particularly through Scheduler of Population Decree of 1783. This decree incentivized white migration to Trinidad by offering land grants for every enslaved African brought to the island. As a result, the colonial authorities favored white migrants and perpetuated pigmentocracy and shadism, where lighter-skinned individuals received preferential treatment. To be recognized as a person by the colonial state, one had to adopt European ways of life, perpetuating a hierarchy where non-Europeans were deemed inferior. This attitude was particularly pronounced during the 17th to 19th centuries, as Europeans sought to Christianize and civilize enslaved Africans. The historical context of interracial relationships in Venezuela's colonial era led to a significant mixed-race population by the 1950s. This color context privileged lighter skin over darker skin pigmentation, shaping attitudes towards race and identity. In Trinidad and Tobago, similar dynamics occurred, with free-colored individuals distancing themselves from African ancestry to align with Eurocentric identities. These colonial attitudes manifest in contemporary relations between Trinidad and Venezuela, particularly during the migrant influx crisis. Oppressive tactics rooted in colonial legacies perpetuate denigrating stereotypes and contribute to anti-immigrant sentiments towards Venezuelan migrants. Furthermore, the transatlantic context involving the USA, Venezuela, and Trinidad and Tobago further complicates these dynamics. Venezuela's history of political turmoil and economic challenges exacerbated by U.S. interventions and sanctions has contributed to outward migration to neighboring countries, including Trinidad and Tobago. Despite historical ties between Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago, anti-immigrant attitudes towards Venezuelan migrants have intensified, ignoring the rich cultural exchange and shared history between the two nations. These attitudes reflect colonial continuities and perpetuate neo-colonial dynamics that undermine regional solidarity and sovereignty. The influence of the U.S. on Venezuela has been significant, particularly through sanctions imposed due to ideological differences. Venezuela's adoption of communism and dictatorial leadership has clashed with U.S. ideals of capitalism and democracy, leading to economic hardships exacerbated by sanctions. The U.S. government's stance on Venezuela has influenced Caribbean nations, including TNT, to distance themselves from their Venezuelan neighbor for fear of reprisal. Even if there is support for Venezuela, it is often driven by self-interest rather than genuine regional solidarity, reflecting colonial attitudes perpetuated in the neo-colonial era. Historically, colonial attitudes were perpetuated by a select group of whites and privileged non-whites who upheld oppression towards enslaved blacks. Today, these attitudes persist in the treatment of Venezuelan migrants in TNT, echoing Trump-like sentiments and highlighting the continuation of colonial legacies through migration dynamics. The rise of Trumpism in the USA, marked by Donald Trump's presidential campaign in 2015 and subsequent election in 2016, was fueled by growing divisions within American society. Trump's rhetoric focused on issues of Americanism and immigration, portraying immigrants as threats to U.S. society and development. This rhetoric resonated globally, including in the Caribbean, where the sudden influx of Venezuelan migrants in 2018 sparked anti-immigrant sentiment reminiscent of Trump's discourse. Venezuela's political and humanitarian crisis has led to millions fleeing the country, with many seeking refuge in neighboring TNT. However, these migrants face significant challenges due to TNT's lack of comprehensive policies for refugees and asylum seekers. While the government has implemented migration registration frameworks to address the crisis, anti-immigrant sentiments persist, contributing to negative experiences and threats to the livelihoods of Venezuelan refugees. Tensions between Trinidad and Tobago and the USA over policy decisions regarding Venezuelan migrants further complicate the situation. The coronavirus pandemic in 2020 exacerbated these tensions, with migrants being scapegoated for various issues, including the spread of COVID-19. Anti-immigrant attitudes continue to shape public discourse and policy responses, highlighting the underlying facets of trinbago Trumpism. The trinbago Trumpism research adopts a virtual ethnographic approach spanning from 2016 to 2021, employing a triangulated methodology. This methodology incorporates social media commentary, historical publications, participant observation of Trinidadian and Tobagonian citizens, and speeches by key figures such as the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago and former US President Donald Trump. Through analysis of virtual newspaper social commentaries, the author identifies local attitudes towards Venezuelan migrants, revealing parallels with immigration speeches by Trump and Trinidadian Prime Minister. Participant observation and historical sources further support the argument that trinbago Trumpism represents a distinct yet interconnected discourse within contemporary Trinidad and Tobago. This discourse is characterized by the themes such as send them home, they are criminals, and Trinidad and Tobago first, reflecting colonial era attitudes that continue to shape societal perceptions and treatment of migrants. The research on trinbago Trumpism utilizes various types of data to illustrate historical sources and speeches that contribute to the discourse. Historical sources indicate the colonial era preferences for migrants, which privilege white, economically affluent, and culturally European individuals, while marginalizing those of African, Chinese, mixed race, Indian, and indigenous ancestry. Former US President Trump's speech are analyzed for their dehumanizing rhetoric towards Mexican migrants, echoing characteristics historically applied to marginalized groups. Similarly, Trinidad and Tobago's Prime Minister replicated Trumpist rhetoric, emphasizing a nationalist Trinidad and Tobago first stance. Participant observation of conversations with Trinidadian and Tobagonian citizens revealed major themes, including the perception of Venezuelan migrants as criminals and sex workers, criticism towards those advocating for their human rights, and the belief that Venezuelans are a burden on society. Additionally, social commentary from Venezuelan featured newspaper articles and online platforms illustrates prevalent attitudes towards Venezuelan migrants. Themes such as labeling Venezuelan women as sex workers, calls for their deportation, and perceptions of superiority over Trinidadians and Tobagonians are highlighted. Trinbago Trumpism manifests in those three main characteristics and help shape the neo-colonial contemporary discourses in Trinidad and Tobago, echoed by dehumanizing ideologies, criminalization, and a nationalistic rhetoric. So if we are now to go into detail with them, let's discuss send them home. This aspect of trinbago Trumpism devalues Venezuelan migrants, portraying them as unwanted and inferior. There were many virtual comments on those newspaper commentaries, such as, "We don't want them here," right? Which reflect very much a widespread approval because a lot of persons liked these comments. Venezuelans are often stereotyped as burdensome, with their presence perceived as a drain on TNT society. A commenter said, "Gosh, everywhere you turn is a Veni, in your streets, in your backyard, all over the place. Just now they will take over. It's just too much, and some have attitude already." Right? So you get to see the depth to which they discuss and the feelings of getting them out of here has transpired. Also, the other idea, they are criminals. Venezuelan migrants, particularly women, are both criminalized and sexualized in trinbago Trumpism discourse. They are labeled as sex workers, perpetuating harmful stereotypes and contributing to their marginalization. Even Veni men are portrayed as lacking financial stability and contributing to criminal activities, aligning with the rhetoric of Trumpism regarding Mexican migrants when he stated the following: when Mexico sends its people, they are not sending their best. They are not sending you. They are not sending you. They are bringing drugs. They are bringing crime. And they are rapists. Particularly in Trinidad and Tobago, Venezuelan women are simultaneously criminalized and sexualized. Being labeled a sex worker carries a sexual and criminal connotation because it is against the law to solicit. Additionally, it also connotes breaking the socially approved laws of Tianti society, and as such, these women are usually slut-shamed. Elahi and Gomes suggested that the stereotypes around the drug trade are tied into narratives of their involvement in crime. As such, Venezuelan women are blamed for the breakup of marriages on the idea that loose migrant women seduce and steal local men from respectable partners. Again, blaming the woman for the choices of the man. And finally, the key characteristic of trinbago Trumpism is Trinidad and Tobago first. Similar to Trump's America's First stance, trinbago Trumpism prioritizes the interests of Trinidad and Tobago over those of migrants. The specific quote attributed to Dr. Rowley, our Prime Minister, is as follows. Let me just quote: America is a sovereign nation, and our first priority is always the safety and security of our citizens, unquote. Donald J. Trump. I could not agree more. Trinidad and Tobago has that same position. This statement reflects Dr. Rowley's alignment with prioritizing the safety and security of the nation's citizens, echoing sentiments similar to those expressed by former President Trump. Nationalistic rhetoric echoed by Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley emphasizes that kind of America's Donald Trump's perspective of America first. Right? And this is tied to the nation's rhetoric of the small size of our country and the economic deprivation, which also reinforces that kind of anti-immigrant sentiment. Now, where do we go from here? Right? What are the solutions? So in terms of my research, I advocate for policy changes. I suggest that CARICOM should advocate for ending U.S. sanctions on Venezuela and implement migrant-centered policies to address the root causes of migration and provide support for Venezuelan migrants. Also, I looked at institutional reforms, improving conditions in immigration detention centers through institutional training, legislative reforms, and increased input from Venezuelan migrants in decision-making processes. When you look also at the awareness of the public education and sensitization, I suggest that we implement public education programs to increase awareness and understanding of the challenges faced by migrants, both historically and in contemporary society. And as well, monitoring and evaluation, establishing monitoring and evaluation programs where migrants can voice grievances and address social and economic inequalities within Trinidad and Tobago to ensure their issues are taken seriously. Right? And also, we need to develop more research. Alright, so some of my suggestions for future research is really exploring how migrants resist these oppressive circumstances and ideologies like trinbago Trumpism, providing insight into effective strategies for addressing and challenging that kind of trinbago Trumpist neo-colonial narrative. Now, I know I'm not here with you all in person, and I know some of you all may have some questions. So I have some prospective questions that I don't know if it may address what you all want, but I tried. What are the main characteristics of trinbago Trumpism, right? Trinbago Trumpism exists in three key aspects: send them home, they are criminals, and try and Tobago first. These attitudes stem from colonial ideologies and involve dehumanization, criminalization, and nationalistic rhetoric towards Venezuelan migrants. So really and truly, I connect the past with the present, looked at America, looked at Trump's impact, and connected it all to create this trans-historical idea of trinbago Trumpism. Our next question is, how do trinbago Trumpism attitudes manifest in society? Trinbago and Trumpism attitudes are evident in public discourse, social media commentary, and political speeches. They contribute to the marginalization and stigmatization of Venezuelan migrants, perpetuating negative stereotypes and justifying exclusionary policies. Right? As well, another possible question could be, what are some suggested solutions to address trinbago Trumpism? I believe a lot of you all, everyone heard these solutions just now, right? But really, in a nutshell, it's about including advocating for policy changes at the regional level, implementing institutional reforms to improve migrant conditions, and conducting public education and sensitization programs, and monitoring those programs and all those things. So that paints a very holistic picture, and a lot of these recommendations were already made in previous research, right? But however, I really cemented it in this research. And also, how does trinbago Trumpism relate to broader global trends? So trinbago Trumpism shares similarities with populist and nationalist movements worldwide, particularly in its prioritization of national interests and the marginalization of migrant populations. Understanding these connections can provide insights into the broader dynamics of globalization and migration. So, it is very much intertwined with the global geopolitical structure. And what role does neoliberalism play in shaping attitudes towards Venezuelan migrants? That question naturally flows. Neoliberalism, in the context of my work, will refer to the economic and political ideology that prioritizes free market principles, deregulation, and privatization. In the case of trinbago Trumpism, neoliberal policies may exacerbate social and economic inequalities, leading to xenophobia and resentment towards migrants perceived as competing for limited resources. Right? And also, too, as well, to what extent has Trinidad and Tobago changed since the completion of my research on trinbago Trumpism? And what I would really say is, we have made a few strides despite the connections with the Prime Minister and, certain statements he has made. He did try, to contribute to some form of equality for the Venezuelan migrants, despite some Trumpist statements. But really and truly, there's much more we can do, because they are still heavily stigmatized. They're still stereotyped. And we need to understand as well that we should see ourselves as a global community, regional community, and that sense of neighborliness. Another question is, can you elaborate on your virtual ethnographic approach and how it was conducted? And that is important because it's a new approach that is done locally. So this virtual approach involves connecting data from online sources, such as social media, news articles, historical publications, and try to identify patterns to prove and ensure and reinforce credibility, right? So by immersing oneself in an online community and documenting virtual interactions, insights into prevailing attitudes and discourses towards Venezuelan migrants, I was able to get, a comprehensive picture, looking at all the likes, how many people like certain comments. So then you get a general sense of a lot of how the population think about certain realities. Right? So thank you again for allowing me to speak. And in my contribution, I also addressed certain questions that you may have. Right, so have a great day.